They were not just warriors, they were two souls bound beyond the limits of time and empire. Alexander the Great, the conqueror of worlds, and Hephaestion, his most trusted general, shared a love that burned brighter than any victory flame. Together they rode across deserts, crossed oceans, and faced death side by side. When the world saw a king and his commander, Alexander saw only the man who held his heart. In the chaos of conquest, their love became his only peace, a bond history could never silence. Long before the clash of armies and the echo of victory cries, there were two boys growing up in the heart of ancient Macedonia. Alexander, the son of King Philip II, was destined for greatness. His tutors spoke of legends of Achilles and Patroclus, of heroes who loved and fought side by side. Hephaestion, a noble boy of quiet grace and piercing intelligence, came into Alexander's life not as a rival, but as a mirror, a reflection of everything he longed to be. They studied together under Aristotle, their minds shaped by philosophy, their souls drawn to ideas of honor, loyalty, and love. In the quiet gardens of Myesa, where marble columns met soft sunlight, their friendship began to grow into something deeper. For Alexander, Hephaestion was more than a friend. He was the one person who saw beyond the title of prince. When others bowed, Hephaestion spoke with the ease of an equal. They debated about the stars, shared scrolls of Homer, and often dreamt aloud about the lands beyond the known world. There was an invisible thread that tied them, a trust so absolute that even silence between them carried meaning. Ancient writers would later call them inseparable, but those words barely touched the truth of what existed between them. As they grew older, Macedonia changed. Philip's ambitions expanded, and so did the dangers around the young prince. Political plots, betrayals, and endless wars shaped Alexander's youth. But amid all the chaos, Hephaestion remained constant. When others fought for power, he fought only for Alexander. Together they learned the ways of war, training with sword and spear until their movements became instinct. Their bond was tested not by distance but by the rising expectations of destiny. When Alexander ascended to the throne after his father's assassination, he was still barely more than a boy. The world saw a new king hungry for conquest. Hephaestion saw the same boy he had known in Aristotle's courtyard, passionate, impulsive, and lonely beneath the crown. Hephaestion became his companion in every campaign, his voice of calm when rage burned too bright, and his shadow in every battle. Their relationship was an open secret within the Macedonian army. Soldiers whispered, but none dared question it. In the world of the Greeks, love between men was not hidden. It was seen as a bond of virtue, a connection that strengthened courage and loyalty. For Alexander and Hephaestion, it was not about secrecy or rebellion. It was simply who they were. Their closeness was natural, unashamed, and visible to all who marched with them. During the Great Persian campaign, when Alexander led his army across the Hellespont and into Asia, Hephaestion rode beside him. They shared tents, meals, and nights under the stars where strategy and affection mingled in quiet conversation. Hephaestion was not only a soldier, he was the keeper of Alexander's mind. When the king's temper flared, it was Hephaestion who softened it. When the burden of empire weighed heavy, it was Hephaestion who reminded him of the boy who once dreamed of greatness for its own sake, not for conquest. Historians have often written of Alexander's glory, of cities founded and empires conquered, but hidden between those lines is the story of the one man who truly knew him. Hephaestion's loyalty was not born of duty, it was born of love. He was trusted with the king's deepest thoughts, his private fears, and his grandest visions. There were moments recorded faintly in the writings of ancient chroniclers that show how openly Alexander valued him. In one account, when an ambassador mistook Hephaestion for Alexander because of their striking resemblance, the king smiled and said, "You are not mistaken, for he too is Alexander." That single phrase revealed more than any confession could. It was not only admiration, it was identity. To Alexander, Hephaestion was another self, the living extension of his soul. In the heat of battle, their eyes would find each other through chaos, a silent understanding that no word could capture. The army followed Alexander's command, but Hephaestion was the heartbeat behind it. Their relationship deepened as victories piled up. After the fall of Tyre, after the long march through Egypt where Alexander was hailed as a god, Hephaestion remained beside him, never overwhelmed by the growing myth of the man he loved. Hephaestion saw through the divine titles and royal ceremonies. He saw the human beneath the armor. When Alexander stood before the oracle of Ammon, proclaimed as the son of Zeus, Hephaestion was the only one who could still speak to him as an equal. There are fragments of letters and stories from that time that show a tenderness often missing from tales of conquest. Alexander would write affectionate notes to Hephaestion, sometimes teasing, sometimes deeply emotional. In public, they often dined together, and in the Persian courts they were treated as partners. The Persians, who believed in hierarchical relationships, saw their closeness as something divine. For them, it was natural that a godlike king would share his heart with one beloved companion. When Alexander married Roxana, many historians note that Hephaestion was not cast aside. Their love may have changed its form, but it did not fade. In fact, Hephaestion's position in the royal hierarchy only grew stronger. He was given command over vast armies, entrusted with diplomatic missions, and honored with titles that reflected his unmatched closeness to the king. In one famous incident, during the conquest of Persia, Alexander and Hephaestion visited the tombs of Achilles and Patroclus, the legendary warrior pair often described by poets as lovers. Alexander laid a wreath on Achilles' grave. Hephaestion placed one on Patroclus's. The symbolism was unmistakable. To the soldiers watching, it was a public declaration of what everyone already knew. Alexander was Achilles and Hephaestion was his Patroclus, bound by love, loyalty, and the promise that neither life nor death could separate them. Their bond transcended politics and power. When other generals schemed for favor, Hephaestion needed no ambition. His place in Alexander's life was untouchable. There were moments when envy stirred among the nobles, yet Alexander never allowed anyone to speak against Hephaestion. The king who could raise cities to dust would not tolerate a single word of disrespect toward the man he loved. Hephaestion's influence extended beyond affection. He shaped Alexander's decisions. During the campaigns in Persia and India, Hephaestion served as both strategist and confidant. Many of the king's most humane policies, acts of mercy toward conquered cities, respect for local customs, and the vision of a unified empire, were encouraged by Hephaestion's wisdom. He understood that Alexander's dream was not merely to rule, but to connect. Together they imagined an empire where East met West, where culture and love could coexist. But even amid triumph, shadows began to gather. Endless battles wore down their spirits. The roads grew longer, the wars bloodier. Alexander pushed further into India, chasing horizons that seemed to retreat with every step. Through it all, Hephaestion remained. He endured disease, exhaustion, and the loneliness of command. Those who traveled with them wrote that when Alexander fell ill, Hephaestion refused to sleep until the king's fever broke. And when Hephaestion himself grew weak, Alexander stayed by his side, refusing food, praying to gods he barely believed in. Their love existed in a world where strength was worshipped, yet it was built on tenderness. They did not need to hide because in their hearts what they shared was not shameful. It was sacred. Ancient Greek culture had many forms of love, passion, friendship, devotion. But what Alexander and Hephaestion had was something greater. It was a fusion of every kind, impossible to separate. By the time they reached Babylon after years of conquest, Alexander had become a legend. Yet behind every tale of his greatness there stood the quiet shadow of Hephaestion, the man who shared his victories, his grief, and his soul. Every king has advisors, but few have ever had a companion so deeply interwoven into their life that one could not exist without the other. In this first chapter of their journey, the world saw two conquerors. But history, when seen through gentler eyes, reveals what truly drove them. Not only ambition, but love. A love so powerful it survived the judgment of armies, the passage of empires, and the silence of centuries. Their story began as friendship, grew into devotion, and evolved into a bond that the world's greatest conquests could never overshadow. The empire stretched wider than the imagination of any man. From the marble palaces of Greece to the burning sands of Persia and the lush rivers of India, Alexander's name echoed like thunder. He was no longer just a king. He was a myth being written in real time. Yet amidst all the glory and divine titles, one constant remained: Hephaestion. The world saw Alexander as a conqueror chosen by the gods. But Hephaestion saw the same restless soul he had known as a boy in Mysa. The boy who once spoke of heroes had become one himself, and yet he still reached for the hand of the one who had always stood beside him. In every city Alexander conquered, Hephaestion's presence was like a quiet reflection of the king's own will. He was not only the commander of cavalry but also the heart of the army. When soldiers saw Hephaestion ride out, they followed with loyalty that came from his humility and fairness. He listened to them, ate with them, and understood their fatigue. Alexander trusted him with missions that demanded both strength and wisdom: negotiations with Persian nobles, the management of new provinces, the handling of delicate alliances. Every success of Alexander's empire had Hephaestion's fingerprints hidden somewhere within it. Their love had matured, no longer the wild passion of youth but the quiet, enduring connection of two lives intertwined. They had survived battles, betrayals, and the temptations of power, but with empire came distance. As Alexander's divine image grew, so did the pressure to act like a god among men. The court began to whisper that a mortal bond like his with Hephaestion was beneath the son of Zeus. Yet Alexander refused to let pride erase the one person who grounded him in humanity. When others bowed to his supposed divinity, Hephaestion alone dared to speak to him as a man. Their conversations in the dim hours of night after the tents had fallen silent were filled with confessions of exhaustion and the shared ache of a life lived for greatness. There were times when jealousy tested them, not between them, but from others. Ambitious generals resented Hephaestion's closeness to the king. They spread rumors, questioned his authority, and sought to divide them. But Alexander's loyalty never wavered. He saw through their schemes. Once, when a rival accused Hephaestion of arrogance, Alexander replied that Hephaestion's heart was purer than any in his court, and that those who envied him did so because they could never understand true devotion. To the outside world, their relationship was an enigma, part brotherhood, part partnership, part love. To Alexander, it was simply the foundation upon which his entire life rested. Their bond was publicly acknowledged when Alexander organized a grand ceremony in Susa, marrying his generals to Persian noblewomen in a symbolic gesture of unity between East and West. Alexander himself married Roxana, but at the same event, Hephaestion was married to Drypetus, the sister of Roxana. It was not coincidence. Alexander wanted their fates bound even in name. He told his companions that by marrying sisters, he and Hephaestion would become one family, their bloodlines joined forever. To the watching world, it was a political move. To those who knew their hearts, it was the king's way of declaring that no power, not even royal marriage, could separate them. As the years passed, their lives became consumed by endless campaigns. India was the final horizon, the land where Alexander hoped to meet the edge of the earth. The journey was brutal. Dense jungles, monsoon rains, diseases, and fierce resistance. Through every hardship, Hephaestion remained his unwavering companion. When the army faltered, Alexander would look to him, and in his calm gaze he would find strength again. There are accounts of moments when Hephaestion rode at the front lines, his armor shining in the rain, his presence as commanding as the king's. The soldiers saw them as twin spirits, two halves of one will, driving them forward. Yet even legends are mortal. After years of conquest, the endless march began to take its toll. The strain of battle and disease haunted the camp. Both Alexander and Hephaestion were exhausted, their bodies worn by years of war. But in the quiet spaces between battles, they still found solace in each other's company. They would sit by the riverbanks, sharing memories of Macedonia, of the olive trees and the songs of home. It was in those rare, peaceful moments that Alexander's divine mask would fall away, revealing the vulnerable man beneath, a man who loved deeply and feared loss more than death itself. Then, in the city of Ecbatana, fate struck the cruelest blow. Hephaestion fell ill, likely from fever or infection. At first, Alexander dismissed it as something minor. He had seen his companion survive wounds and fatigue far worse. But as days passed, Hephaestion grew weaker. The physicians tried everything: prayers, sacrifices, medicines, but nothing could stop the slow dimming of his strength. Alexander refused to leave his side. He sat beside him day and night, holding his hand, speaking softly to him as if words could anchor him to life. The army stood in silence, knowing that the heart of their king was breaking before their eyes. When Hephaestion took his final breath, the world seemed to collapse for Alexander. The man who had faced 1,000 enemies without fear now wept uncontrollably. He shut himself in his tent, refusing food and comfort. For 3 days he neither slept nor spoke. When he emerged, he was not the same man. He had lost not just a general, but the other half of his soul. Ancient writers described his grief as unimaginable, the kind that could only come from a love deeper than friendship. stronger than brotherhood. He cut his hair, as Achilles had done for Patroclus, and ordered the entire empire into mourning. The funeral that followed was one of the grandest in ancient history. Alexander commanded that no expense be spared. The pyre built for Hephaestion reached higher than any monument in Babylon. It was said that the flames could be seen from miles away, lighting the night sky like a second sun. Thousands of soldiers stood in silence as the fire rose, the heat mingling with tears. Alexander threw himself before the flames, calling upon the gods to take him too. His generals had to pull him back, fearing he would die with Hephaestion's body. The ritual offerings that followed were unprecedented. Horses, treasures, and entire regiments were sacrificed in his honor. It was not just the funeral of a commander, it was the farewell of a beloved. Alexander ordered that temples be built for Hephaestion across the empire. In every province, statues were raised bearing his likeness. He declared him a divine hero, to be worshipped alongside the gods. Some historians criticized the king's obsession, but those who understood saw it for what it was, the desperate attempt of a man to preserve his love beyond the reach of death. He renamed cities in Hephaestion's memory, and made his mourning a national decree. Even as the empire stretched to its limits, Alexander's heart remained anchored to the ashes of the man he had lost. After Hephaestion's death, Alexander's spirit dimmed. The man who had once burned with boundless ambition began to move through life as if haunted. He continued to lead his army, but without joy. He spoke often of meeting Hephaestion again in the next world. Some say that he visited the oracle again, asking if his companion had become a god and if he too would join him soon. In private, he surrounded himself with Hephaestion's armor, letters, and personal belongings. He would not allow anyone else to sleep in his tent or touch the things they had shared. His nights became long vigils where he stared into the dark as if waiting for a voice that would never return. Those last months in Babylon were filled with a strange restlessness. Alexander planned new campaigns, but those around him saw that his heart was no longer in conquest. He had faced every enemy the world could offer, but he could not conquer grief. The once invincible warrior now carried a wound that no weapon had made. His soldiers whispered that the gods were punishing him for loving too deeply, but Alexander did not care for their words. For him, Hephaestion was already divine, and he longed to follow him. Only 8 months after Hephaestion's death, Alexander himself fell ill. Some said it was poison, others claimed exhaustion or fever. Whatever the cause, his body gave way to the sorrow that had consumed him. As he lay dying, his thoughts were not of kingdoms or glory, but of the one who had gone before him. Those who tended to him said he spoke Hephaestion's name again and again, his final words soft and longing. When he finally passed, it was as if the fire that had once lit the world had gone out. History remembers Alexander as a conqueror, but beneath that legend lies the story of a man whose greatest victory and greatest loss were both born of love. The empire he built eventually fractured. His generals divided his legacy, but the memory of his bond with Hephaestion endured. Poets compared them to Achilles and Patroclus. Philosophers called it a union of souls. And through the centuries, their story survived as one of the most powerful testaments to love in all its forms. It was not defined by the rules of their time, nor by the judgments of history. It was a love that dared to exist proudly and openly in an age of warriors and gods. In the end, Alexander's vast empire crumbled, but his devotion did not. The ruins of his cities may have turned to dust, but their story continues to be written in the hearts of those who believe that love, no matter how the world sees it, can shape history itself. Their names spoken together, Alexander and Hephaestion, still echo across time, a reminder that even the mightiest conqueror was, at his core, a man who loved and was loved beyond measure. After the fire that consumed Hephaestion's body had faded and Alexander himself was gone, the world began to crumble under the weight of his absence. The empire he had forged through years of war and bloodshed broke into pieces, divided among his generals like the shards of a shattered crown. Cities he had named after himself became battlegrounds for ambition. Yet even in this chaos there was one thing that refused to die: the memory of his love for Hephaestion. It lingered in the hearts of soldiers who had marched beside them, in the temples Alexander had built, and in the quiet whispers that passed through history like the echo of a lost song. The ancient world, so used to stories of conquest and blood, found itself haunted by something softer, the image of a warrior who had loved with devotion stronger than empire. Poets began to weave their story into legend, comparing them to Achilles and Patroclus, the archetypes of heroic love. It was said that just as Achilles had avenged Patroclus, Alexander had sought immortality through Hephaestion. The parallel was too perfect to ignore, and in many ways Alexander himself had shaped it. When he visited Troy years before his own death, he had stood before Achilles' tomb and whispered prayers not for victory, but for love that could defy death. Now history saw that wish fulfilled. As centuries passed, storytellers could not agree on what their bond truly was. Some described them as brothers in arms, others as lovers who defied the boundaries of their age. Ancient Greek culture had its own understanding of love between men. It was not condemned or hidden, but seen as part of a continuum of affection, from mentorship to passion. To them, love between warriors was the highest form of loyalty, a fusion of courage and tenderness. In that sense, Alexander and Hephaestion were not unusual, but what made them unforgettable was the openness of their devotion and the scale of what it inspired. In Babylon, the temples Alexander had dedicated to Hephaestion became places of quiet worship. Offerings were left by soldiers who believed that the spirit of Hephaestion could protect them in battle. Some claimed to see visions of the two standing side by side in armor, watching over the lands they had once conquered. The Persians, who had once feared Alexander, began to weave their own interpretations, calling the pair the twin stars of the West. They were no longer just men. They had become symbols of unity, of love that transcended borders and mortality. But as new powers rose, their story began to blur. The Romans admired Alexander's conquest but found his emotional openness unsettling. In a world that worshipped strength and discipline, the vulnerability of his love was something they preferred to ignore. They rewrote him as a god, a figure of unstoppable ambition, stripping away the human heart that had driven him. Hephaestion's name began to fade from official accounts, reduced to footnotes, his statues left to crumble in forgotten temples. Yet no matter how history tried to reshape the legend, the truth refused to disappear entirely. In quiet corners of libraries and the margins of manuscripts, the bond between them still glowed like an ember that would not die. During the later centuries, as empires shifted and philosophies changed, the story of Alexander and Hephaestion resurfaced again and again. Medieval scholars reading the ancient texts found themselves moved by the fragments of tenderness buried beneath the tales of war. They wrote of Alexander's grief, of the temples he built for his beloved, of the sleepless nights he spent in mourning. Even when their culture could not name what it was, they felt the power of it. Pain and love, intertwined beyond explanation, spoke to something eternal in the human heart. In Renaissance Europe, artists rediscovered the ancient world with new eyes. They painted Alexander not just as a conqueror, but as a man torn between divine ambition and earthly desire. Hephaestion began to reappear in art, sometimes in the background, sometimes beside the king, their faces turned toward each other in shared sorrow or triumph. The myth of their union became a symbol of loyalty and devotion that transcended the boundaries of time. For thinkers and poets, they represented an ideal, that true greatness is not only found in conquest, but in love that dares to stand beside power. Their story traveled beyond the West as well. In Persian and Indian retellings of Alexander's life, where he was known as Sikandar, the bond between the two men was remembered as sacred. Some versions spoke of Hephaestion as Alexander's soul mirror, a spirit sent by the heavens to guide him through his earthly trials. In these tales, their reunion after death was inevitable, destined by fate. The conqueror and his beloved would meet again in the stars, their spirits entwined forever. Even in regions where same-gender love was rarely spoken of, the poetry surrounding them dared to whisper it, wrapped in metaphors of devotion and destiny. Through centuries of changing morals and religions, their love became both inspiration and controversy. Some historians tried to erase it, calling it exaggerated friendship. Others defended it, pointing to the evidence that had survived, the letters, the ancient accounts, the grief that could not have been born from friendship alone. The debate itself became a testament to their power, even in death. They challenged the world to question how love should be defined. In modern times, as societies began to embrace more open understandings of identity and love, the truth of their bond emerged from the shadows again. Historians re-examined the records without the filters of prejudice, finding in them a story that had always been there. The story of two men who lived and loved without apology. Alexander's words at Troy, His mourning in Babylon, the temples he built, the letters that survived, all spoke of a love that dared to exist in the full light of history. The world at last began to see them not just as warriors, but as lovers whose story belonged among the greatest romances ever told. Their tale also began to inspire a new kind of heroism, not the kind that seeks to conquer lands, but the courage to love openly in a world that often resists it. Alexander and Hephaestion's legacy became a mirror for those who loved against the expectations of their time. Their bond showed that love is not bound by gender, culture, or the ages. It is a force that carves its own path through history. In art, literature, and film, their names returned, carried by voices that finally dared to speak what ancient poets once knew, but later generations tried to silence. The ruins of the cities they founded still stand in fragments. In Egypt, in Iran, in Afghanistan, in India, and though the inscriptions of their time have faded, the invisible story remains. Every historian who writes of Alexander's grief is writing, in some small way, about love. Every artist who paints his mourning face brings Hephaestion back to life. Together they became not just figures of history, but symbols of something eternal. The truth that even the mightiest among us are shaped not by conquest, but by the people we love. If you walk through the archaeological remains of Babylon today, you can still find the traces of the great funeral pyre. The stone foundations are buried beneath layers of time, but when you stand there, it is easy to imagine the flames that once lit the sky, a blaze born from devotion. Somewhere in that ash, the bones of a general and the tears of a king merged into dust that carried both their names. The wind that sweeps over those ruins whispers not of victory, but of love, a love that even centuries could not erase. Philosophers have often said that immortality is not achieved through power, but through remembrance. If that is true, then Alexander and Hephaestion achieved a form of eternity that no empire could rival. Their story survives in every retelling, reshaped but never forgotten. They are remembered in the verses of poets, in the brushstrokes of painters, in the hearts of those who see beauty and defiance. For every age that tried to bury them, another age rose to bring them back. The tragedy of their separation and the purity of their connection continue to resonate because their story is not only about kings and generals, and it is about what it means to be human. It speaks to the loneliness of greatness, the cost of ambition, and the ache of love that refuses to fade. Alexander, who once claimed to be the son of Zeus, was at his truest when he was simply a man mourning the loss of his beloved. That vulnerability, that surrender to feeling, is what made him eternal. As history marches forward, their names remain entwined. Alexander and Hephaestion, two men who faced the world together, who defied gods and nations, and whose love became stronger than myth. It is said that every time a historian writes their story, the spirits of the two rise again, standing side by side as they always did. Perhaps they wander still, not as conquerors or heroes, but as two souls at peace, forever bound beyond life and time. And maybe that is the greatest conquest of all. Not the taking of cities or the building of empires, but the triumph of love that refuses to die no matter how many centuries pass. Their story reminds us that power fades, monuments crumble, and kingdoms fall. But love, true unyielding love, leaves an imprint on eternity. Alexander's empire has long vanished, but Hephaestion's name lives because Alexander refused to let the world forget him. In that choice, he gave their love immortality. Today, scholars still debate the nature of their relationship, but perhaps the answer has always been simple. The words Alexander spoke after Hephaestion's death, the temples he built, the grief that consumed him, they were not acts of friendship. They were the acts of a man whose heart had been torn from his chest, and through that love we see the truth of who Alexander really was. In the end, history may call him the Great, but his greatness was not only in his battles or his empire. It was in his capacity to love so completely that the memory of that love has survived the fall of civilizations. Alexander and Hephaestion's story is not just a tale of the ancient world. It is a reminder that love, in any form, has the power to outlive every boundary. So when the night falls over the old ruins of Babylon or the wind whispers through the stones of ancient Troy, perhaps somewhere in that eternal quiet, their spirits walk together still, two warriors, two lovers, and two souls who conquered the only thing that truly matters, time itself.